Sing, Omega. Let the kingdom see whether your curse takes the prince next. The command rolled through the Blackwood throne hall like thunder trapped beneath stone, and every noble head turned toward Grace Miller as if she were not a girl in a mud-stained white dress, but a storm someone had foolishly invited indoors. She stood at the center of the hall with a silver voice lock resting cold against her throat, its runes dim but hungry, waiting for the smallest note to leave her mouth. 3 years of exile had made her thinner, quieter, harder to see, the way people stopped noticing an old candle after the flame went out. But the court noticed her now. They noticed the frayed hem of her dress. They noticed the pale skin at her wrists where the winter had left its bite. They noticed that an Omega had been brought before the Alpha King's throne, and that she had not bowed low enough to satisfy them. On the black marble dais, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood watched without moving. He was a man carved from silence and command, broad-shouldered beneath a dark formal coat, his fair face unreadable, his gray eyes colder than the snow pressed against the stained glass windows. Beside the throne stood Madison Vale, the favored Luna candidate, graceful in silver silk, smiling as if Grace's shame were a song she had rehearsed for weeks. Beta Ryan Cole held the key to the voice lock between 2 fingers. Once, he had been the one to send Grace beyond the northern border with only a worn coat and the accusation that her lullaby had cursed a royal wolf. Now he looked at her like a mistake that had crawled back into the kingdom. "You remember the rules," Ryan said softly, though the whole hall heard him. "No Omega magic inside royal walls unless commanded by the crown." Grace kept her hands folded in front of her. Her fingers trembled, but her voice did not. "Then do not command it." A murmur passed through the court. Omegas did not answer betas that way. Exiles did not answer anyone at all. Madison's smile sharpened. "How noble. The cursed girl pretending restraint is mercy." Grace looked past her, past the jeweled collars and polished boots, past the alpha lords who had already judged her, toward the tall windows where the snow moved like white ash. She had promised herself she would never sing for people who only wanted proof that she was a monster. Her mother's lullaby had been meant for frightened wolves, abandoned children, sleepless nights. Not for entertainment. Not for judgment. Not for a court that wanted her broken and grateful. Ryan stepped closer and unlocked the silver band. It opened with a small, delicate click that sounded louder than the winter wind outside. The pressure around Grace's throat eased, and the silence that followed became enormous. "Sing," Madison whispered. Grace lifted her chin. No, the word was small. It still reached the throne. For the first time, Ethan Blackwood's eyes narrowed. The air changed, heavy with pine, cold stone, and something older than law. Ryan's face flushed with anger, but before he could speak, a sound echoed from behind the throne. A soft crash, then another. The hidden door to the royal nursery shuddered open, and the entire court went still. Prince Oliver Blackwood, the Alpha King's only cub, stumbled into the hall in a tiny gray sleep shirt, one hand pressed to his chest, his golden eyes clouded with panic. He had not spoken in 3 years. He had not reached for anyone in 6 months. Yet his gaze found Grace as if he had followed her voice through the dark before she had even used it. The little prince took one unsteady step onto the marble, then another, while healers froze and nobles forgot to breathe. Ethan rose from the throne so fast the room seemed to shrink around him. Grace felt every instinct in the hall scream at her to stay where she was, to lower her eyes, to let the powerful handle what belonged to them. But beneath the silence, beneath the fear, she heard something no one else did, a child's whisper caught between heartbeats. "Make the dark stop." Grace moved before permission could exist. Ryan hissed her name. Madison went pale. Ethan's command struck the air like a closing gate. "Do not touch him." Grace stopped only inches from the cub, her knees brushing the frozen marble, her open hands empty and visible. Prince Oliver stared at her, trembling, then reached out and caught the sleeve of her dress with desperate little fingers. The court inhaled as one body. The Alpha King did not move. His wolf did. Somewhere deep inside that terrible silence, Grace heard it answer the child's fear with a low, stunned growl. And then Prince Oliver opened his mouth and spoke the first word the kingdom had heard from him in years. "Sing." The word left Prince Oliver in a cracked whisper, but it struck the throne hall harder than any royal command. For 3 years, the kingdom had measured the little prince by his silence. They had built rules around it, medicines around it, rumors around it. Now that silence had broken for an exiled Omega kneeling on the marble in a ruined dress, and no one knew where to place their fear. A healer rushed forward with a glass vial glowing faintly blue, but Oliver recoiled so sharply that the vial slipped from her hand and shattered across the floor. The liquid steamed against the black stone, filling the air with the sharp scent of winter herbs and silver ash. Ethan descended the steps from the throne, each footfall slow, controlled, and terrible. His eyes never left his son, but the pressure of his presence wrapped around Grace until her lungs felt too small for breath. "Step away from him," he said. Grace should have obeyed. Every law in the kingdom said she should lower her head, fold herself into nothing, and let the Alpha King decide whether his son lived behind walls she had never been worthy to enter. But Oliver's fingers tightened in her sleeve. His tiny hand was cold, much too cold, and beneath his skin Grace felt a tremor that did not belong to fever. It pulsed like a shadow trying to breathe. "He is not afraid of me," Grace said, barely above a whisper. "He is afraid of whatever is inside him." Madison gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. Listen to her. One word from the prince, and suddenly she speaks like a royal physician. Ryan moved to seize Grace by the shoulder, but Oliver turned his face into her palm and released a small, broken growl. It was not loud. It was not threatening. It was a warning from a frightened child who had found the only warm thing in a room full of power. Ryan froze. Around the hall, the royal guards shifted, uncertain whether to protect the prince from Grace or Grace from the prince. Ethan stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Grace could see the silver threads in his dark cuffs, close enough to smell pine, cold rain, and the clean iron scent of a king holding his fear behind his teeth. "What did you do to him?" he asked. Grace looked up at him then, not proudly, not defiantly, with the exhausted honesty of someone who had been blamed too often to dress the truth in pretty words. "Nothing. I heard him." A low murmur spread through the court. Ethan's jaw tightened. "No one hears him." "I did." Oliver's breathing hitched. His golden eyes rolled toward the high ceiling, unfocused, as if he were watching something crawl across a place no one else could see. Grace placed her other hand near his cheek without touching him fully, giving him the choice. "Oliver," she whispered, though no one had told her to use his name. "Look at me. Not at the dark. At me." The prince dragged his gaze back to her. His little claws loosened from his own shirt and closed around her fingers instead. A sound moved through the wolves chained beyond the open side arches of the hall, a restless wave of paws against stone, then silence. Ethan heard it. Everyone heard it. The war wolves, beasts trained to answer only royal blood, had gone still for her voice before she had sung a single note. Madison's smile vanished. Ryan stepped back as though the marble under Grace had turned sacred. Grace felt the old fear rise in her throat, the memory of another hall, another accusation, another creature she had tried to comfort and failed to save. She had promised never to sing where hatred was listening. But Oliver's hand was so small inside hers, and his whisper came again, thinner this time. "Please." The word undid her. Grace turned to Ethan, and the whole court seemed to lean toward the breath between them. "If I sing, do not interrupt me," she said. Ethan's eyes flashed, dangerous and bright. "You are giving conditions to your king?" "No," Grace answered. "I am giving your son a chance." For one endless second, no one moved. Then Ethan lifted one hand, and every guard in the hall lowered their weapons. Madison started to protest, but his gaze cut to her with such cold finality that her mouth closed around the words. Grace drew Oliver closer, not into an embrace, not yet, only close enough for him to feel that he was not alone on the freezing marble. Her throat still burned where the voice lock had rested. Her heart beat like frightened wings beneath her ribs. She closed her eyes and reached for the lullaby she had buried with her mother, the song that had cost her a home, a name, and every door that had ever closed against her. When the first note left her lips, it was barely sound at all. It was breath shaped into mercy, and somewhere beneath the palace, something ancient woke up and listened. The first note trembled through the throne hall like a candle flame trying to survive a storm, small enough to be dismissed, pure enough that no one could look away. Grace did not sing like the court musicians who performed for banquets and victories. There was no polish in her voice, no glittering pride, no practiced sweetness meant to flatter kings. Her song sounded like a mother humming beside a cold window, like a child being told the night would end, like an apology offered to every lonely creature that had ever curled up in the dark and waited for someone to come back. Prince Oliver stopped shaking first. His fingers, still wrapped around Grace's hand, loosened by a fraction. The cloudy gold in his eyes flickered, then focused on her face as if the sound were a lantern he could follow. Grace kept singing, one careful breath after another, afraid that if she pushed too hard the fragile thread between them would snap. Behind the side arches, the royal werewolves lowered themselves to the stone floor. These were not gentle animals. They were massive, disciplined, raised under royal command and trained to stand unmoved through thunder, fire, and battlefield horns. Yet under Grace's broken lullaby, they folded down one by one, their golden eyes softening, their great heads resting against their paws. A stunned whisper passed through the nobles. Madison's hand tightened around the silver railing beside the throne. Ryan stared at the wolves as if the floor had opened beneath his memory. Ethan did not speak. He stood so still he seemed carved into the palace itself. But Grace could feel his attention like winter sunlight on her skin, cold, sharp, impossible to ignore. Then Oliver drew a breath. It was not steady, not yet, but it was his own. The sound slipped into the hall, thin and miraculous, and several healers covered their mouths. Grace should have felt relief. Instead, a chill ran through her chest. Something inside the prince stirred in response to the song, a dark knot buried beneath his heartbeat. And as Grace's next note rose, that darkness reached for her. Pain flashed through her throat, not sharp enough to stop her, but deep enough to make her knees weaken. A faint gray mark appeared beneath the skin of her wrist, twisting like smoke under glass. The court did not see it at first. Ethan did. His eyes dropped to her hand, and the calm mask on his face cracked. "Enough," he said, low and dangerous. Grace shook her head once without breaking the melody. If she stopped now, Oliver would fall back into the dark place that had held him for years. She understood it with the certainty of breath. The song was not destroying the curse. It was calling it out, coaxing it away from the child the way one might lure a frightened animal from a trap. But it needed somewhere to go. It chose her. The marble beneath Grace's knees felt colder than snow. The old accusation returned with cruel clarity. Cursed girl, cursed voice, cursed Omega. For one heartbeat, fear almost swallowed the song. Then Oliver leaned closer and pressed his small forehead against the back of her hand. "Stay," he whispered. Grace's voice steadied. She sang for the child, not the court. She sang past Madison's fear, past Ryan's guilt, past Ethan's command, into the hidden chamber beneath every royal law where grief had been locked away and called strength. The werewolves exhaled together, a deep sound that rolled through the hall like distant thunder becoming prayer. The silver chains along their collars clicked open, not breaking, simply releasing as if the metal itself had remembered mercy. Madison stepped backward. "That is impossible." Oliver's color returned slowly, warmth blooming in his cheeks. His tiny claws faded back into childlike fingers. Grace felt the darkness coil around her own pulse. Heavier now, colder now, but she held the final note until the prince's breathing settled into a steady rhythm against her hand. Only then did she let the song fade. Silence rushed in after it, huge and trembling. Oliver looked up at Ethan with clear golden eyes, then turned back to Grace and smiled for the first time anyone in that room had seen. Grace tried to smile back, but the hall tilted. The gray mark on her wrist darkened, and her breath caught like frost inside her lungs. Ethan crossed the distance in an instant, catching her before she touched the marble. For one stunned second, the exiled Omega rested in the arms of the Alpha King, while his son clung to her sleeve, and every wolf in the royal hall bowed its head. Grace woke to the scent of clean linen, winter herbs, and silver. For a moment she thought she was back beyond the northern border, curled beneath a broken roof while the wind searched for cracks in the walls. But the surface beneath her was too soft, the air too warm, the silence too expensive. She opened her eyes to a ceiling painted with black wolves running beneath a silver moon. Royal Infirmary. The realization moved through her slowly, heavier than pain. Her right wrist was fastened to the bedside rail with a polished silver restraint, not tight enough to wound, but cold enough to remind her exactly what the kingdom believed she was. Dangerous, untrusted, useful only while watched. Grace swallowed, and her throat burned as if every note she had sung had left frost behind. The gray mark beneath her skin was still there, curling faintly around her pulse like smoke trapped in glass. "Do not touch it," a voice said from the shadows. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stood near the tall window, his dark coat removed, his white shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, his face as controlled as the storm pressing against the glass. He looked less like a king in that dim room, and more like a man who had spent hours arguing with fear and refused to admit fear had answered. Grace lowered her hand. "Where is Oliver?" Ethan did not answer immediately. His gaze moved from her wrist to her face. "Sleeping. For the first time in months." Relief struck so hard her eyes stung, but she blinked it back before he could mistake it for weakness. "Then why am I chained?" "Because every wolf under my command knelt to your voice," Ethan said. "Because my son asked for you before he asked for me. Because a curse that has resisted royal healers for 3 years moved from his body into yours like it recognized you." His voice dropped, colder. "So I will ask once. What are you?" Grace gave a tired, humorless breath. "An exiled Omega." "That is not an answer. It is the only title your kingdom left me." Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. Before he could speak, the infirmary doors opened and Madison Vale swept inside with 2 senior councilmen behind her. She had changed from silver silk into white, the color of innocence chosen too carefully. Her eyes found the restraint on Grace's wrist, and satisfaction softened her mouth. "Your Majesty, this cannot continue. The child is attached to her because of spell work. The wolves submitted because of spell work. An Omega who can influence royal beasts is not a healer. She is a threat inside the palace walls." Grace looked at Ethan, expecting agreement, expecting the old pattern of powerful people deciding her name while she sat close enough to hear it. But then a cry rose from the hallway. Small, hoarse, terrified. Ethan turned at once. Another cry followed, and the lamps along the wall flickered as if the palace itself had flinched. A young nurse appeared at the door, pale and breathless. "Your Majesty," Prince Oliver woke up. "He is asking for her." Madison stepped between the door and the bed. He must be weaned from the influence immediately. The cry became a frightened whimper that twisted through Grace's ribs. She pulled once against the restraint, not hard, just enough for the silver to sing against the rail. "Let me go to him." Ethan looked at her wrist. "If this is manipulation, I will know." "If it were manipulation," Grace whispered, "I would have asked for freedom. Before I asked for your son." The room went still. Slowly, Ethan crossed to the bed. He took the silver key from the healer's tray and unlocked the restraint himself. The moment the metal released her, Grace slid her feet to the floor. Her legs trembled, but she stayed upright. From somewhere down the corridor, Oliver sobbed again, and Grace answered with one soft note, barely more than breath. The sound drifted out of the infirmary and down the royal hall. The crying stopped. Every councilman stared. Madison's face lost its careful calm. Ethan held the open restraint in his hand, his eyes fixed on Grace as if the world had just moved beneath his throne. Then he turned to the guards at the door and spoke with the quiet force of a final law. "From this moment forward, Grace Miller is under the protection of the crown. Anyone who touches her without my command answers to me." By nightfall, Grace Miller had a room in the royal wing, 3 guards outside her door, and half the kingdom whispering that the Alpha King had brought a curse into the heart of his house. Protection, she learned, could feel almost the same as captivity when every hallway went silent before she entered it. The palace servants would not meet her eyes. The healers spoke around her instead of to her. Noble daughters paused behind marble columns to measure her plain borrowed dress, her pale face, the gray marks still coiled beneath the skin of her wrist. She was no longer the forgotten exile outside the gates. She was worse. She was visible. Prince Oliver refused to sleep unless her door remained open and her voice drifted softly down the corridor, not a full song, only a low hum steady enough to keep the shadows from gathering in his dreams. Ethan allowed it, but he never looked pleased by the necessity. He stood at the edge of Oliver's chamber each evening like a king guarding a border he did not understand, watching his son breathe easily for the first time in years because of the one woman his court wanted removed. Grace felt his questions even when he did not ask them. Why you? Why now? What did my kingdom bury when it buried your name? On the third morning, the council summoned her to the Hall of Lineage, a long white chamber beneath the eastern tower where every noble bloodline in Blackwood history had been carved into silver-veined stone. Madison Vale waited beside the central altar in a gown the color of fresh snow, her blonde hair pinned with moonstones, her smile gentle enough to fool anyone who had never been lonely. Beta Ryan Cole stood beside her holding a leather folder sealed with red wax. Grace knew that folder. She had seen it 3 years ago, the night her exile became official. The sight of it made the room tilt for half a second, but she kept walking. Ethan stood near the altar with Oliver at his side. The little prince held a carved wooden wolf in one hand and Grace's sleeve in the other, as if the entire council might vanish if he let go. This is not a trial, Madison said sweetly. It is clarification. Grace looked at the circle of Alpha Lords. People usually say that before a trial begins. A few faces tightened. Ryan opened the folder. The records state that Grace Miller sang over a royal wolf found ill near the northern border. By sunrise, the animal was gone, and the pack reported unnatural behavior among every wolf that heard her voice. His tone was smooth, practiced, merciless without ever sounding loud. She was exiled to prevent greater harm. Oliver's grip tightened. Grace felt the old shame rise like cold water, but Ethan spoke before she could. Those records are incomplete. Madison turned to him with perfect concern. Then let her prove it. If her gift is truly healing, she should sing before the lineage stones. Royal blood recognizes truth. Grace's throat closed. It was a trap dressed as tradition. If she refused, they would call it guilt. If she sang, they would call any reaction a spell. The council watched her with hungry patience. Even Ethan could not protect her from a law old enough to wear the face of honor. Grace stepped toward the altar, not because Madison commanded it, but because Oliver's fear had begun to tremble through the sleeve in her hand. Before she could open her mouth, something changed in the far wall. A painted mural of the first Luna, half hidden behind shadow and age, gave a soft crack. Grace turned slowly. No one else seemed to notice at first. The white wolf in the painting, a sacred guardian with moonlit eyes, was no longer looking toward the throne as it had for centuries. Its painted face had turned toward Grace. A dark silver tear slid down its muzzle, shimmering against the stone like a secret finally tired of silence. From inside the wall came a melody Grace knew with every bone in her body. Her mother's lullaby, sung by no human throat. The council fell silent. Madison went still. Ryan's folder slipped slightly in his hand. Grace stared at the ancient wolf as the stone beneath her feet began to hum. And for the first time since her exile, she understood with terrifying clarity that her song had never been the curse. It had been the key. The melody inside the wall did not sound old. It sounded alive, as if someone had been waiting behind the stone for years with one hand pressed over her mouth, saving the truth until Grace Miller was brave enough to hear it. The Hall of Lineage held its breath around her. Silver veins in the floor brightened beneath her feet, spreading in thin lines toward the altar, toward Prince Oliver, toward Alpha King Ethan Blackwood, and finally toward the gray mark beneath Grace's wrist. The mark answered with a cold pulse that made her fingers curl. She saw it then, not with her eyes, but in the place where songs became memory. A circle of women in pale cloaks standing beneath a winter moon. Wolves lying at their feet, not conquered, but comforted. A child with royal blood crying in the dark. A voice saying, "The song does not erase pain. It carries it where it can no longer poison the innocent." Grace staggered, and Oliver clutched her sleeve. "Grace," he whispered. Ethan stepped closer, his face tight with alarm, but the white wolf in the mural gave another silent tear, and the truth unfolded inside Grace like a door opening beneath the world. Her voice had never been a curse. It was an inheritance, older than the Blackwood throne, older than the laws that had condemned her. The lullaby her mother sang was the forgiveness song, a moonborn healing meant to draw darkness out of royal blood without destroying the one it lived inside. But every healing had a price. To sing it completely, the singer had to release the wound that bound the curse to her own heart. Grace looked at Ryan Cole. The room blurred around him. She saw again the northern gate, the winter road, The way his silence had weighed more than any accusation because he had known enough to doubt and still chosen power. Forgiveness rose before her like a mountain in the snow. Not soft, not simple, not pretty. Madison's voice cut through the hall. This is theater. She is manipulating the stones. But her words trembled at the edges. Ethan heard it. Grace heard it too. Before anyone could answer, Oliver gasped. The wooden wolf slipped from his hand and clattered across the marble. Ethan turned, catching his son before he fell, and the entire hall erupted into frightened motion. The dark mark that had faded from Oliver's skin returned in a faint ring around his wrist, and a matching shadow moved across Ethan's forearm as their blood bond carried the curse from child to father. Ethan's eyes flashed gold. Not with anger. With pain he refused to show. The lanterns along the walls dimmed. The werewolves beyond the doors began to whine, low and restless, as if their king's suffering had become a sound inside their bones. Madison stepped back from the altar. Ryan's face lost all color. Grace understood then that the curse had not been removed. It had retreated. It had waited for fear, accusation, and old hatred to feed it again. Ethan held Oliver close, his command shaking the air even as he fought to remain still. Everyone out. No one moved quickly enough. Grace moved instead. She crossed the silver-lit floor toward him, each step pulling cold through her veins. Madison whispered, "If she sings again, she will bind them to her." Grace did not look at her. She looked only at the child struggling to breathe through a darkness he had never deserved, and at the king whose power could not protect the one life he loved most. "The song needs the truth," Grace said. Ethan's gaze locked on hers. "What truth?" Grace turned to Ryan. Her throat burned before she sang a single note. "That I was not exiled because I killed a royal wolf. I was exiled because someone needed the kingdom to fear the only voice that could save it." Ryan opened his mouth, but no defense came. Grace felt every eye in the hall press against her. The old wound inside her wanted justice. It wanted him named, exposed, humiliated the way she had been. But Oliver made a small sound against Ethan's shoulder, and the choice became painfully clear. Grace stepped to the center of the glowing floor and faced Ryan without lowering her eyes. "I do not forgive you because you deserve peace," she whispered. "I forgive you because he deserves life." Then she began to sing, and the palace stones answered her with the voices of every forgotten wolf beneath the moon. The song rose from Grace like a fragile light passing through deep water, and the hall of lineage changed around it. The silver veins in the marble brightened until every noble face appeared pale and exposed, stripped of titles, jewelry, and practiced lies. Then the floor became a mirror, not a reflection of bodies, but of memory. The first image formed in the stone beneath Grace's bare feet. A moonlit stable near the northern border, 3 years earlier, with a royal wolf lying weak beneath a wool blanket, while a younger Grace knelt beside it and sang through tears. The court watched in absolute silence as the memory unfolded. Grace had not stood over the wolf like a curse. She had held water to its mouth. She had wrapped its trembling body in her own coat. She had sung because no healer had come. Then the image shifted. A gloved hand appeared in the memory, dropping a small black vial into the wolf's drinking bowl before Grace ever arrived. The hand wore a moonstone ring. Madison Vale went still. The ring on her finger caught the light, identical, undeniable. A sound moved through the council, low and horrified. Madison lifted her chin, but the song did not allow her silence to survive. Another memory opened in the floor. Madison speaking with Ryan Cole beneath the old northern gate, her voice smooth as frost. "Let the Omega take the blame. The kingdom must never learn what her voice can undo." Ryan stood beside her in the memory, younger, uncertain, but not innocent. He held the exile order in one hand and the truth in the other, and he chose the paper. Grace's voice trembled, but she did not stop. Every note pulled another thread from the knot of lies. The council saw sealed reports hidden beneath floorboards, healers paid to forget, old records altered so the Moonline bloodline would vanish from history. They saw Madison's family crest stamped on letters describing a curse placed upon the Blackwood heirs, not to destroy the crown at once, but to make the king desperate enough to accept the bride they selected. Ethan's face became terrifyingly calm. Oliver stood beside him, both hands clutched around the carved wooden wolf, his clear golden eyes fixed on Grace, as if her song were the only wall between him and the dark. Madison backed away from the altar. This is not truth. This is Omega enchantment. But her voice cracked on the final word. Ryan moved toward the glowing floor, panic breaking through his polished mask. Stop her. The law forbids uncontrolled magic in a royal chamber. No guard moved. The werewolves outside the hall pressed close to the open doors, silent and watchful, their heads lowered not in obedience to Ethan, but in recognition of Grace. That frightened the court more than any shout could have. Madison turned sharply toward the council. If you let her finish, she will own the prince, the king, and every wolf in this kingdom. Grace's next note faltered, not because Madison had frightened her, but because the curse inside the room heard fear and fed on it. Oliver gasped softly. A shadow flickered at his wrist. At the same instant, Ethan's hand tightened against the edge of the altar, and the lanterns dimmed until the hall looked buried beneath storm clouds. Grace understood. The curse was not only in blood. It lived in accusation, in shame, in every cruel story repeated until the innocent began to believe it. Madison reached for the old ceremonial bell on the altar, the one used to end testimony before verdict. If she rang it, the song would be broken by law, and the council could pretend they had not seen enough. Ethan stepped forward, but an elder alpha lifted his hand. Your Majesty, until the song is complete, any interference may be called royal coercion. The law trapped him for one unbearable second. Madison smiled through her fear and raised the bell. Grace could have stopped singing to defend herself. Instead, she looked at Ryan, the man who had opened the gate to her exile, and let the wound inside her loosen one final inch. Her voice grew softer, not weaker, and the melody wrapped around the bell before Madison could sound it. The metal gave no ring. It only wept a clear silver dust onto the altar. Ryan sank to his knees, not harmed, not forced, but broken by the sight of his own choice made visible before the kingdom. I knew, he whispered. I knew she was trying to save it. The confession moved through the hall like a door unlocking. Grace's song surged, and the white wolf in the mural stepped halfway out of the stone, moonlit and enormous, its ancient eyes fixed on Madison. At last, the court saw the truth Grace had carried alone for 3 years. The exiled Omega had never brought the curse into Blackwood Kingdom. She had been the only one it feared. The white wolf stepped from the mural as if moonlight had learned how to breathe, and the hall of lineage trembled beneath its paws. No one screamed. Fear had gone too deep for sound. The ancient guardian stood behind Grace Miller, taller than any werewolf, its fur glowing with soft silver fire, its eyes carrying centuries of sorrow and command. Grace felt it at her back without turning. She felt the weight of every forgotten healer, every silenced voice, every Omega girl taught that gentleness was weakness until the kingdom needed mercy more than power. Her song changed. It no longer sounded like a lullaby meant for one frightened child. It became wider, older, threaded with the howl of distant mountains and the hush of snow falling over graves that had never received justice. The palace answered. Stone pillars shuddered. The silver veins in the floor blazed bright enough to cast every shadow out of hiding. Outside the tall windows, hundreds of wolves gathered in the courtyard, black, gray, white, and gold-eyed, their faces lifted toward the tower as though the song had called them home from every corner of the kingdom. Prince Oliver took one step away from Ethan and toward Grace. Ethan caught his shoulder, not to stop him, only to steady him. The dark ring around the prince's wrist began to loosen, smoke thinning beneath his skin until it lifted like mist at sunrise. A matching shadow pulled away from Ethan's forearm, twisting in the air between father and son, searching for a place to hide. Madison stumbled backward. For the first time, her beauty looked fragile, painted over panic. The moonstone ring on her finger cracked with a sound like ice splitting on a frozen lake. The darkness rushed toward it. She whispered, "No," so softly that only Grace seemed to hear. But the song did not punish her. It revealed her. Around Madison, memories rose in pale ribbons, letters sealed in secret, promises traded for a crown, a child's illness treated as an opportunity, an exile signed with a smile. The court saw everything, not through rumor, not through accusation, through truth clear enough to make even the proudest alpha lower his eyes. Ryan remained on his knees, his face buried in his hands. Madison turned to Ethan as if his authority could still save her from what her choices had built. Your Majesty, please. She is controlling what you see. Ethan looked at Grace, and something in his face shifted forever. He was no longer seeing an exile, a threat, or a mystery brought into his hall by desperation. He was seeing the woman who had carried his son's darkness in her own body and still chosen to sing. Grace's knees shook. The mark on her wrist flared silver instead of gray. The final verse rose in her throat, but it demanded more than breath. It demanded she release the last chain of bitterness, not for Madison, not for Ryan, not for the court, but for herself. Grace closed her eyes. She saw the road beyond the northern gate. She saw the girl she had been, cold and alone, waiting for someone to call her back. Then she let that girl stand up inside her heart and walk toward the light. The final note left Grace like sunrise breaking through a locked room. The curse unraveled. It did not explode. It did not strike. It dissolved into silver dust that lifted through the hall and vanished before it touched the ceiling. Oliver inhaled sharply, then laughed, small and stunned and alive. Ethan's wolf answered from deep within him, not with rage, but with a low, reverent sound that made every royal wolf in the courtyard bow. One by one, the werewolves inside the hall lowered their heads to the marble. Then the nobles followed. Alphas who had never bent to anyone sank to one knee. The council bowed. The servants wept quietly near the doors. Grace stood at the center of the glowing floor, too exhausted to understand that the entire kingdom was kneeling around her. Ethan walked down from the altar, slow and deliberate, until he stood before her. Then the Alpha King lowered himself to one knee. The hall fell into a silence, so complete it felt sacred. Ethan took Grace's trembling hand, not as a ruler claiming what he wanted, but as a king acknowledging what his kingdom had thrown away. Blackwood Kingdom exiled its own salvation, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Oliver slipped beneath his arm and wrapped himself around Grace's waist. The ancient white wolf rested its luminous head behind her shoulder, and for the first time in 3 years, Grace Miller was not the girl accused of carrying a curse. She was the voice that had broken it. Morning came slowly to Blackwood Kingdom, not as a victory horn or a royal announcement, but as pale gold lights spilling across the snow and touching the broken place in the Hall of Lineage where the truth had finally been allowed to stand. Grace Miller woke in the same royal wing that had once felt like a guarded cage, but this time the door was open, the silver restraints were gone, and Prince Oliver was asleep in a chair beside her bed with one hand still curled around the edge of her blanket. Someone had placed a fresh white shawl over Grace's shoulders. It smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, and for one quiet moment, she could almost believe her mother had walked through the room while she slept. Ethan Blackwood stood near the window, watching the courtyard below where hundreds of wolves rested in peaceful circles beneath the thawing trees. He turned when Grace stirred, and the fear she expected to see in his eyes was no longer there. Neither was pity. He looked at her with something heavier and more careful than either, the kind of respect that did not rush to name itself. The council is waiting, he said. Grace glanced at Oliver. For me. For your voice, Ethan answered. Then, after a pause, and for your judgment. The words should have frightened her. Instead, they settled around her like a cloak she had not asked for, but somehow already knew how to wear. By noon, the kingdom gathered again in the throne hall. Madison Vale stood before the council without moonstones, without silk, without the soft smile she had used like a blade. Ryan Cole stood apart from her, pale and hollow-eyed, the weight of confession sitting on his shoulders more heavily than chains ever could. The nobles who had mocked Grace did not meet her eyes. The servants did. So did the wolves. That was what nearly broke her. Not the court bowing. Not the Alpha Lord silent at last. It was the old kitchen maids, the stable boys, the frightened Omegas at the back of the hall looking at her, as if one of their own had walked through fire and come back with daylight in her hands. Ethan sat on the throne, but he did not speak over her. Oliver stood at Grace's side, clean-faced and bright-eyed, holding the wooden wolf against his chest. The chief elder read the charges in a voice that shook only once. Lies against the crown. Corruption of royal records. Concealment of a curse. Abuse of exile law. When the reading ended, Madison looked at Grace with tears that seemed more afraid than sorry. Please, she whispered. You sang forgiveness. The hall held its breath. Grace stepped forward. Her throat still ached. Her wrist still bore the silver mark. No longer smoke, no longer shadow, but a thin crescent of moonlight beneath her skin. Forgiveness is not permission, she said softly. It does not erase what happened. It does not return the years stolen from me. It does not make a child's suffering useful because it revealed the truth. Madison lowered her head. Ryan's eyes closed. Grace looked at him then, and the old road beyond the northern gate passed through her memory one final time. I forgive the wound you left in me, she said. But the kingdom will answer the choices you made. The sentence was not cruel. That was why it reached everyone. Madison was stripped of all claim to the Luna seat and placed under guarded judgment until every hidden record could be restored. Ryan lost his title and was ordered to serve the border pacts he had once helped condemn, not as punishment alone, but as a living witness to the cost of silence. No one cheered. Grace was grateful for that. Justice, she was learning, did not need applause to be real. When the council turned to her status, Ethan rose. The hall lowered its gaze at once, but he looked only at Grace. Grace Miller is no longer an exile of this kingdom, he said. She is royal voice of Blackwood, protector of the air, and the woman our wolves recognized before any of us were wise enough to understand why. A whisper moved through the court, but Oliver ran into Grace's arms before formality could swallow the moment. Grace Mother, he said, bright and certain, and the word opened something tender in the room. Grace held him carefully, her eyes burning, while Ethan stepped down from the throne and stood beside them, not claiming her, not rushing fate, simply standing where the kingdom could see that she would never be left alone at its gates again. Outside, the snow finally stopped. Grace walked onto the balcony with Oliver tucked against her side and Ethan at her shoulder. Below them, wolves